Corporal Hans Müller couldn't believe his eyes. Standing in the mess line at a prisoner-of-war camp somewhere in Kansas, he watched American guards heap his tray with portions that seemed impossible: roast beef, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, fresh vegetables, white bread with butter, and there, gleaming at the end like a mirage, real ice cream for dessert. Müller had surrendered 3 weeks earlier in Tunisia, expecting the starvation and brutality that Wehrmacht propaganda had promised awaited captured soldiers. His last hot meal had been 4 days before capture, watery soup with bread so hard it could crack teeth. Instead, he now faced an abundance of food he hadn't seen since before the war began. "I thought this was Allied propaganda," one captured soldier later recalled, watching fellow prisoners devour their first American meal. "I could not believe we had more food than many German civilians." They weren't exaggerating. While German citizens back home struggled to survive on ration cards providing barely 1,500 calories daily, little more than starvation level. German prisoners in American camps received the same rations as United States soldiers. That meant nearly 4,000 calories per day, with meat that was rationed for American civilians, fresh fruit, coffee, and even beer and cigarettes available at camp canteens. Müller entered American captivity weighing just 128 pounds, his frame wasted by years of wartime deprivation. His story, and what happened to him over the next 2 years, would reveal one of World War II's most shocking and least-known strategies. Across 425,000 German prisoners held in 700 camps throughout the United States, the story repeated itself. Men who expected suffering found surplus. Soldiers who anticipated punishment discovered unprecedented generosity. The contrast was so stark that prisoners initially burned their leftover food, fearing their captors would reduce rations if they realized how much remained uneaten. How did America accomplish this seemingly impossible feat? And why? German soldiers marching toward Allied lines in North Africa, Italy, and France carried more than rifles and ammunition. They carried expectations shaped by years of Nazi propaganda about what awaited them in enemy hands. Wehrmacht briefings painted vivid pictures of barbaric American captors who would torture prisoners, withhold food, and exact brutal revenge for German military successes. These warnings found fertile ground in memories of the First World War, when Allied blockades had starved German cities and left 763,000 civilians dead from malnutrition. The reality facing German troops by 1944 made surrender seem even more desperate. Back home, the vaunted German food supply system was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombing campaigns and territorial losses. At the war's outbreak in 1939, German civilians had received ration cards guaranteeing 2,700 calories daily. By mid-1944, as American and British forces severed supply lines from occupied territories, those rations plummeted to just 1,200 calories per day, barely above starvation level. German soldiers in the field faced their own deprivations. The once reliable Wehrmacht supply system, which had efficiently fed millions of troops during early victories, now faltered. Frontline units received irregular deliveries of the standard iron rations, 300 grams of canned meat and 125 grams of hard bread daily. Officers privately acknowledged that hunger weakened combat effectiveness as much as Allied firepower. Soldiers captured in Tunisia and Sicily during 1943 had often gone days without hot meals, their bellies cramping from hunger even before surrender. Against this backdrop of genuine deprivation, Nazi propaganda worked overtime to convince troops that capture meant certain death or worse. Wehrmacht commanders circulated stories of American savagery, claiming that prisoners faced execution, forced labor until death, or systematic starvation designed to punish the German nation. These narratives deliberately invoked memories of World War I's hunger blockade, warning soldiers that Americans sought revenge through denial of food. Many German troops believed they faced a choice between fighting to the death or surrendering to conditions more brutal than any battlefield. Back home, Americans faced their own struggles with rationing. Starting in May 1942, every household received war ration books that transformed ordinary shopping into careful planning. Sugar was limited to half a pound per person weekly, barely half their normal consumption. A pound of bacon cost 30 cents plus 7 ration points. Coffee was restricted to 1 pound every 5 weeks. Most civilian drivers were restricted to just 3 gallons of gasoline weekly. The math was punishing, and Americans knew it. Yet news about prisoner of war camps sparked immediate controversy. Letters flooded into Washington by the hundreds each week, many demanding harsher treatment of German prisoners. The most common complaint: why should enemy soldiers receive meat that American housewives couldn't purchase without ration stamps? Why feed prisoners butter when civilians may do with margarine? The government's explanation, that Geneva Convention compliance encouraged Germany to treat American POWs humanely, failed to satisfy angry citizens reading casualty lists in their daily newspapers. Labor unions mounted organized opposition, viewing German prisoner labor as undercutting American workers. The office of the Army Provost Marshal General found itself publicly defending decisions that seemed to prioritize enemies over citizens. Behind this public controversy, however, military planners had developed a strategy that would prove devastatingly effective. American military planners had implemented a strategy that would fundamentally reshape prisoner treatment. The decision stemmed from the Geneva Convention of 1929, which mandated that prisoners of war receive food rations equal to those provided to the captor nation's base troops. But the United States Army went beyond mere compliance. The Office of the Provost Marshal General, working closely with the Quartermaster Corps, transformed Geneva Convention requirements into a weapon of psychological warfare. The Quartermaster Corps faced unprecedented logistical challenges. Feeding 425,000 German prisoners across 700 camps scattered throughout 46 states required industrial-scale planning. They developed centralized procurement systems and established supply chains ensuring uninterrupted delivery. When rail lines couldn't reach remote camps fast enough, quartermasters coordinated truck convoys carrying thousands of tons of foodstuffs monthly. Mass canning operations processed meat, vegetables, and fruits at scales never before attempted. Camp commanders received detailed specifications for prisoner rations matching Army garrison standards. A typical German POW's daily allotment included fresh or canned meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread with real butter, coffee, and occasional treats like ice cream or fresh fruit when available. The Quartermaster Corps calculated caloric values meticulously, targeting approximately 4,000 calories daily, sufficient for men engaged in physical labor. This abundance wasn't accidental. It reflected genuine American logistical capacity and strategic intent. The International Red Cross played crucial oversight roles. Their inspectors conducted regular camp visits, documenting food quality, preparation methods, and prisoner satisfaction. These neutral observers verified that American camps exceeded minimum Geneva Convention standards. Camp administrators understood that every Red Cross report became ammunition in the broader propaganda war, demonstrating democratic values through actions rather than empty rhetoric. American strategists recognized something German commanders had missed. Well-fed prisoners cooperated more readily, caused fewer disciplinary problems, and required less intensive guarding. The policy transformed enemy soldiers into productive agricultural workers who voluntarily met work quotas. By 1944, the War Department estimated saving $80 million annually through German prisoner labor that would have been impossible to extract from starving, resentful captives. The food policy thus became a masterwork of practical efficiency disguised as humanitarian generosity. The logistics began in North Africa during spring 1943. After Rommel's Africa Corps surrendered in Tunisia, Britain confronted an immediate crisis: where to house 250,000 captured German soldiers. London appealed to Washington for help. The United States reluctantly agreed, despite having virtually no experience managing large prisoner populations since the Civil War. Liberty ships became the solution. These cargo vessels, designed to transport American troops and equipment to Europe, returned across the Atlantic nearly empty. Beginning in May 1943, Liberty ships carried an average of 30,000 German prisoners monthly to American ports. Hans Müller boarded one of these vessels in June 1943, joining hundreds of other captured Afrika Korps soldiers below deck. They risked German U-boat attacks during the voyage, a bitter irony that their own navy might sink them. After 2 weeks at sea, Müller's Liberty ship docked at Norfolk, Virginia, on August 4, 1943. He expected cattle cars or unheated freight trains befitting captured enemies. Instead, American guards directed prisoners towards sleek Pullman passenger cars with cushioned seats and clean windows. The captured Afrika Korps veterans exchanged bewildered glances. Something didn't match the propaganda they'd been fed for years. The Army had designated camp locations based on strict criteria, rural areas away from strategic industrial targets, regions with mild climates to minimize heating costs, and proximity to agricultural areas facing severe labor shortages. By November 1944, 132 base camps and 334 branch camps held 281,000 prisoners, eventually expanding to over 425,000 Germans across 46 states. Müller's train rolled through Virginia, the Carolinas, and finally into Mississippi, landscapes utterly foreign to a man who'd never left Europe. After 2 days of travel, the prisoners arrived at Camp Clinton near Jackson, Mississippi, where Müller would spend the next 2 years of his life. Müller's first morning at Camp Clinton began with a wake-up call that felt surreally gentle compared to Wehrmacht standards. No screaming sergeants, no frantic assembly. Just a simple announcement that breakfast would be served in 30 minutes. He entered the mess hall expecting thin gruel or stale bread, the meals he'd grown accustomed to in his final months with the Afrika Korps. What he encountered shattered every expectation. Long tables set with actual silverware, not tin cups and wooden spoons. German cooks working in well-equipped kitchens with ingredients furnished by the United States Army. And the food itself, cereal, toast with real jam, hot coffee sweetened with actual sugar, and fresh milk. The portions seemed absurdly generous. Müller initially suspected poison or some cruel psychological trick. He watched other prisoners cautiously take first bites, waiting for someone to collapse or for guards to laugh at the deception. Nothing happened. The food was real, it was abundant, and it kept coming. Lunch brought revelation. Roast pork, actual meat, not gristle or mysterious canned substances, accompanied by potato salad, carrots, and ice water, served in clean glasses. The pork alone exceeded what Müller had eaten in a single week on the collapsing North African front. He ate slowly, savoring every bite, his shrunken stomach protesting the sudden abundance, even as his mind reeled at the impossibility of it all. Supper continued the pattern: meatloaf prepared with real beef, scrambled eggs using fresh ingredients, bread with butter, coffee, and milk. By the end of his first day, Müller had consumed more calories than he'd eaten in the previous 3 days combined. That night, other prisoners whispered in their barracks, debating whether this was sustainable or merely a temporary show for Red Cross inspectors. But it wasn't temporary. Day after day, week after week, the abundance continued. Müller watched his own body transform. Within a month, his uniform grew snug. His ribs, which had been clearly visible through his skin upon arrival, disappeared beneath new flesh. His face filled out. Energy returned to limbs that had felt perpetually exhausted. Other prisoners responded with disbelief that manifested in bizarre behavior. Some, including men in Müller's barracks, began burning their leftover food in secret, genuinely fearing that American guards would reduce rations upon discovering the surplus. The behavior revealed their complete inability to process what was happening. Everything Nazi propaganda had taught them about American weakness, about democratic decadence hiding starvation and industrial collapse. All of it crumbled before the undeniable evidence presented 3 times. Daily on mess hall trays, beer became available for purchase at camp canteens, using the 80 cents daily wage prisoners earned from work details. Muller, who hadn't tasted beer in over a year, stood in the canteen line his second week at camp, handling American coins and selecting from actual choices. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable. This wasn't how prisoners of war were supposed to be treated. This wasn't what he'd been promised would happen if he surrendered. 2 years later, when Muller finally stepped on a scale out of curiosity, he discovered he weighed 185 pounds, 57 pounds heavier than his arrival weight. "I had gotten so fat you could no longer see my eyes," he later admitted with embarrassment mixed with amazement. The transformation wasn't unique. Across 425,000 German prisoners in 700 American camps, the pattern repeated itself with remarkable consistency. The meals accomplished what months of re-education films and anti-Nazi literature could never achieve. They demonstrated American industrial might and logistical superiority through the most fundamental human need, food. Muller began questioning everything else he'd been told. If the propaganda about American food shortages was lies, what about the promised German superweapons? What about the inevitable Reich victory? The mess halls became classrooms teaching hard truths about which side truly commanded superior resources. Back in Germany, whispers started filtering through Red Cross channels. Letters from prisoners in America painted an undeniable picture that contradicted years of Goebbels' propaganda. German families read accounts of sons and husbands gaining weight, working on farms under minimal guard, attending evening classes and theatrical performances. Nazi authorities faced an impossible dilemma: suppress the letters and admit fear of the truth, or allow them through and watch morale crumble. But inside American camps, a different war was erupting, one between the prisoners themselves. Muller witnessed it firsthand in the spring of 1944. A new group of prisoners arrived at Camp Clinton, captured during the Italian campaign. Among them was Oberleutnant Werner Drexler, a U-boat officer who had cooperated with American intelligence after his submarine was sunk. Word spread quickly through the barracks. Hardline Nazi prisoners, led by a charismatic sergeant named Otto Stengel, began holding whispered meetings after lights out. Muller kept his distance, but he couldn't ignore what was happening. Stengel had organized a secret kangaroo court, an internal tribunal that tried fellow prisoners for treason against the Reich. The accused weren't given real trials. Evidence didn't matter. Cooperation with Americans, expressing doubts about Hitler, even gaining too much weight from American rations, all became crimes worthy of punishment. On March 12th, 1944, Muller heard screaming from the shower block. He stayed in his bunk, heart pounding, knowing what was happening, but too terrified to intervene. 7 prisoners, acting on Stengel's orders, beat Werner Drexler to death with improvised weapons. American guards discovered his body the next morning. The murder sent shockwaves through Camp Clinton. Muller realized that the war wasn't over just because they'd been captured. It had simply moved behind barbed wire, where ideology trumped survival. The ideological fracturing intensified across American camps. Even as Germany's defeat became inevitable in early 1945, 8 of 20 camp newspapers still advocated Nazi ideology, desperately clinging to beliefs contradicted by daily evidence. True believers formed secret police networks within camps, intimidating prisoners who dared question the regime. Muller learned to keep his evolving doubts to himself, nodding along when hardcore Nazis proclaimed imminent German victory even as Allied forces closed in on Berlin. Then came April 1945. American authorities announced that all prisoners would attend a mandatory film screening. Muller filed into the recreation hall with hundreds of other prisoners, expecting another Hollywood movie or propaganda film. Instead, the projector showed footage from newly liberated concentration camps: Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. The images on screen defied comprehension. Mountains of skeletal corpses, living prisoners who looked like walking skeletons, gas chambers disguised as showers, crematoria still containing charred human remains. The American narrator's voice described systematic extermination, medical experiments, industrialized murder on scales that seemed impossible. The recreation hall fell silent, except for the projector's whir. Some prisoners wept openly, others sat stone-faced, refusing to process what they were seeing. A few shouted that it was fake, Allied propaganda designed to break their spirits. But Mueller, who had spent 2 years experiencing American honesty through the simple mechanism of abundant food, knew in his gut that this was real. That night, something unprecedented happened at Camp Clinton. Miller joined approximately 300 other prisoners who spontaneously gathered in the central yard. Someone started a fire in a metal drum. Then, one by one, prisoners began throwing their German uniforms into the flames. The symbolism was unmistakable, a collective repudiation of the regime they had served. Not everyone participated. Stengel and his hardcore followers watched from their barracks with barely concealed rage, memorizing faces of those they now considered traitors. The camp had become a microcosm of Germany itself, true believers desperately clinging to a collapsing ideology versus disillusioned realists confronting uncomfortable truths. At Camp Butner in North Carolina, a similar scene unfolded on an even larger scale. After viewing concentration camp footage, 1,000 prisoners burned their uniforms in collective rejection of Nazism. At other camps, the ideological split led to violence. American authorities documented multiple murders of prisoners by fellow prisoners throughout 1945, a grim testament to how thoroughly propaganda had poisoned minds, even when contradicted by lived experience. Miller survived by keeping quiet, but his transformation was complete. The psychological devastation proved more thorough than any battlefield defeat. He had expected torture and discovered comfort. He had been taught to believe in American weakness and encountered undeniable industrial superiority, demonstrated 3 times daily at mess halls, overflowing with food his own nation could no longer provide. The cognitive dissonance had shattered everything he'd believed about the war, his country, and himself. The statistical evidence told a remarkable story. Of the 425,000 German prisoners held in American camps, only 2,222 attempted escape, barely half of 1%. This rate fell below even the Italian prisoner escape rate, and significantly lower than the civilian prison system's escape statistics. Most attempts ended within a day. The most ambitious attempt occurred on December 23, 1944, when 25 German U-boat officers escaped Camp Papago Park in Arizona through a 178-foot tunnel. Their elaborate plan collapsed when they discovered the river marked on their stolen maps was actually a dry riverbed. Within weeks, every escapee had been recaptured, most admitting they'd attempted escape more from boredom than genuine desire for freedom. At Camp Clinton, Miller watched prisoners dig a 100-foot tunnel complete with electric lighting, scattering excavated dirt in their pants legs. Guards discovered it just 10 feet from the fence. At nearby Belzoni, more than 30 prisoners simply walked away one afternoon, only to be found window shopping on Main Street. They explained they'd grown bored and wanted to see the town. The low escape rate reflected something deeper: contentment. German prisoners demonstrated unprecedented cooperation with American authorities. They volunteered for agricultural work quotas, maintained camp discipline through their own officer hierarchies, and caused minimal security incidents despite the ideological conflicts. The War Department's 1944 assessment revealed that prisoner labor saved $80 million annually in military installations alone, economic benefits impossible to achieve with hostile, resistant captives. Red Cross inspection reports consistently praised American camp administration. These neutral observers documented living conditions exceeding Geneva Convention minimums, confirming that propaganda claims of humane treatment matched reality. The reports circulated internationally, providing documentary proof of American moral leadership. Miller spent his days working on local farms, picking cotton and harvesting vegetables alongside other prisoners under minimal guard. He earned 80 cents daily, which he spent on beer, cigarettes, and occasional luxuries at the camp canteen. He attended educational classes in the evenings, watched movies 4 nights weekly, and played on his barracks soccer team. The routine became comfortable, dangerously so. The strategic ripple effects proved profound. Every well-fed German prisoner represented walking evidence contradicting Nazi propaganda. The disconnect between German propaganda promises and American reality created more effective ideological erosion than any re-education program could achieve. Food became the most devastating weapon in America's arsenal. Not bullets or bombs, but proof through full bellies that the Reich had lied about everything. The contrast across theaters of war revealed starkly different philosophies. In Soviet captivity, over 381,000 German prisoners died, according to official records, a mortality rate exceeding 35%. German scholars estimate the actual death toll approached 1 million. Soviet camps offered minimal food, virtually no medical care, and brutal labor conditions in Siberian mines and construction projects. Meanwhile, German camps for Soviet prisoners achieved even worse records. Of nearly 6 million Red Army soldiers captured, approximately 3 million died, a catastrophic 57% mortality rate driven by deliberate starvation policies and systematic brutality. Against this backdrop of atrocity, American camps stood as remarkable aberrations. Of 425,000 German prisoners held in the United States, fewer than 1,000 died during captivity, a mortality rate below 0.25%. Most deaths resulted from accidents, illnesses, or murders by fellow prisoners in ideological disputes, like the Werner Drexler killing. Not a single documented case of death from starvation or deliberate mistreatment by American guards exists in the historical record. The divergence shaped post-war international law. When delegates convened in Geneva during 1949 to revise prisoner-of-war conventions, American practices became reference points for establishing minimum standards. The Third Geneva Convention of 1949 incorporated lessons from World War II, strengthening protections for prisoners and emphasizing humane treatment as legal obligation rather than optional courtesy. Academic historians subsequently analyzed the American POW system as a case study in soft power and moral warfare. Arnold Kramer's comprehensive research, interviewing hundreds of former prisoners decades later, documented that virtually every German captive left American custody with positive impressions of the United States. Many returned to visit camps where they'd been held, bringing families to see places they remembered fondly. Hans Müller was among them. In 1968, he returned to Camp Clinton with his wife and 2 children, showing them the barracks where he'd slept, the mess hall where he'd first confronted American abundance, and the fields where he'd worked. He stood in the empty recreation hall where he'd watched concentration camp footage and made the decision to burn his uniform. "This place saved my life," he told his family, "not just from dying, but from remaining blind." Approximately 5,000 German prisoners, including Müller, emigrated permanently to America after repatriation. They chose to return to the nation that had captured them, bringing skills and gratitude that enriched their adopted country. Müller settled in Ohio, became a machinist, and raised 3 children who never fully understood what their father had experienced until late in his life. Alex Funke, who served as camp chaplain at Camp Algona, reported that of 80 fellow prisoners he corresponded with after returning to Germany, all had become convinced Democrats, not through formal re-education programs, but through lived experience of humane treatment. The food policy demonstrated that democracy could deliver abundance, that American industrial might exceeded Nazi propaganda claims, and that moral leadership carried strategic advantages no weapon system could match. The story that began with Hans Müller staring at a mess tray overflowing with roast beef and ice cream concluded with profound lessons about warfare, propaganda, and human dignity. The contrast could not have been starker. German soldiers expecting starvation discovered abundance. Men anticipating brutality encountered unprecedented generosity. Prisoners indoctrinated to believe in American weakness confronted undeniable industrial superiority, demonstrated through the simplest yet most fundamental metric, food. The numbers tell the tale. 4,000 calories daily versus 1,200 back home. Mueller's 57-pound weight gain in 2 years, mirrored by thousands of other prisoners. Less than 0.25% mortality in American camps versus 35% in Soviet captivity. 2,200 escape attempts from 425,000 prisoners, half the Italian rate, lower than civilian prisons, because captives like Mueller had no reason to flee comfort. $80 million in annual labor savings, because well-fed prisoners cooperated voluntarily. 5,000 former enemies who chose to emigrate permanently to the nation that had captured them. These statistics reveal strategy disguised as humanitarianism. The Geneva Convention of 1929 mandated equal rations. The United States delivered abundance. International law required adequate shelter. America provided recreation facilities, educational programs, and theatrical performances. The treaty demanded humane treatment. American camps offered transformation. Every meal became a propaganda victory, more effective than any leaflet or radio broadcast. Every pound Mueller gained represented proof that Nazi ideology had been built on lies. The internal war between hardcore Nazis and disillusioned realists, epitomized by the Werner Drexler murder and the subsequent uniform burnings, demonstrated that America was winning a psychological conflict even while prisoners remained behind barbed wire. What does this teach us about warfare? Propaganda and human dignity? That soft power achieves objectives force cannot. That moral leadership carries strategic advantages beyond measurement. That treating enemies humanely isn't naive idealism, but calculated effectiveness. The mess halls of Camp Clinton, Camp McCain, and 698 other facilities across 46 states became classrooms teaching democracy's superiority through abundance rather than rhetoric. Hans Mueller returned to Germany in 1946 weighing 80 pounds more than when he'd been captured, carrying memories that would shape the rest of his life. He was one of hundreds of thousands who learned that everything they'd been taught was wrong, not through lecture or force, but through the simple, devastating power of a full plate. Next time, we'll explore another shocking contrast from World War II, how Allied prisoners during the Battle of the Bulge discovered unexpected treatment from their German captors, a story that complicates simple narratives about good and evil in history's most devastating conflict. The truth, as always, proves more complex and fascinating than propaganda ever admits.